Over the last 20 years since The Phantom Menace was released, the Clone Wars and its preceding period have become one of the most beloved and fleshed out periods of Star Wars lore. But what did people think about them before the prequels? Today we're going to be looking at earlier depictions of and references to the Clone Wars to see what the various authors and other creators within the expanded universe thought before we got George Lucas's vision for the period. Most of the books and comics we got before the prequels took place around the time of the original trilogy or later, with very few touching very heavily on earlier periods, but with Obi-Wan's ominous mention of having fought in the Clone Wars alongside Darth Vader in Episode 4, the idea of a galaxy-spanning, devastating war at some point in recent galactic history became a fixture within the expanded universe, though the actual development of the period would be left to George Lucas to flesh out as he saw fit. We were still often introduced to vehicles and vessels, or even whole fleets mentioned as being Clone Wars or pre-Clone Wars vintage, used as kind of an offhand reference to just signify something as being old. Sometimes, though, books, comics, and RPG sourcebooks would venture past vague references into providing information that would seem to give direct hard facts about the mysterious war. And today we're going to be looking at two primary aspects: when people thought the war was, and more interestingly, who they thought fought on each side. I will say that while I've looked into and looked through about as many RPG sourcebooks, novels, and comic books as I could to get specific quotes and references for the video, it's a pretty massive topic that could go in any number of directions, so I had to be a bit selective on what to focus on. If people are interested, it could definitely be a topic we revisit looking at from some other angles. If I have left out a specific element or even just a reference you thought would be interesting, please drop that in the comments though. The evolution of Star Wars canon and how it was treated is always something I love hearing more about. First up, the timing of the Clone Wars. As we know now, the Clone Wars began with Attack of the Clones, which is set in 22 BBY, or years before the Battle of Yavin. We also know the declaration of the Empire from the Republic and wiping out of the Jedi came immediately at the end of the Clone Wars, but all this had received different depictions earlier on. Novels published by Del Rey in their first run with the license from 1976 to 1983, and then published by Bantam Spectra, which held the license from the release of the Thrawn trilogy in 1991 to 1999, all tended to follow a similar timeline for the Clone Wars, which they tended to place somewhere about 10 to 20 years earlier than they actually ended up being set, throwing off the age of some Legends characters, and also they tended to assume the declaration of the Empire and the fall of the Jedi took place over a few years in the Clone Wars' aftermath, as opposed to them being immediately at the end of the war. The X-Wing books have a museum visited by Wedge Antilles on Coruscant hinting at the latter bits of that, with the following quote: "After the resolution of the Clone Wars, the Jedi began to move toward an open grab for power. Senator Palpatine circumvented them and deposed their puppet," so note there that there would have been someone in charge, put in charge by the Jedi, as opposed to them trying to depose Palpatine. "In overthrowing the corrupt Old Republic, the Emperor stripped from the Jedi their political power and laid their evil bare for all to see. The Jedi denied the truth he revealed, all except one of their number. His fellows tried to murder him, but he survived their treachery and rose to assist the Emperor in rooting out the evil that had ruined the knighthood. He was Darth Vader and, said the display, never had there been a greater champion for the high ideals of the Empire than he." This one isn't entirely a huge inconsistency, other than the puppet that it says the Jedi had installed, but this is also political propaganda. As we know now, though, Vader was the one to actually go and end the war by killing the Separatist Council, and after what the display loosely refers to as the Jedi coup. The intention seems to be for more of a protracted power struggle between the Jedi and the Emperor, rather than it just being something that all takes place at the conclusion of the Clone Wars. For the timeline of the war as a whole, the intention is a lot more of a clear contradiction. One of the easy ways to track that is the age of Corran Horn and his father Hal Horn, as stated in the X-Wing books and iJedi. Hal Horn's father, a Jedi named Nija Halcyon, was said to actually have died shortly after the Clone Wars when Hal was 10. Corran himself is about 24 or 25 in Rogue Squadron, which means he would have been born in about 18 BBY, the year after the Clone Wars ended, according to the more fleshed out timeline provided by the prequels. Hal therefore would have to have been about 11 when he had Corran, further supporting that the author, Michael Stackpole, thought that the Clone Wars were about 10 to 20 years earlier, which would have been more reasonable and had a situation where Hal has Corrin between the ages of 21 and 31 rather than when he's 11. There's another reference within the later X-Wing books by Stackpole, where Corrin is within another part of the museum with the Jedi display saying, "A Jedi museum, everything pertained in one way or another to Jedi Knights and Masters, with the vast majority of them having served in the Clone Wars. Just over 40 years ago, all of these people were alive." This in itself isn't a clear direct statement that the Clone Wars were necessarily 40 years before, which would put them at least 37 BBY, since it's saying those people were just alive at that point. However, that number does come up elsewhere. This timeline is also supported by other Legends books from that era before the prequels, including the Thrawn trilogy where, in Dark Force Rising, Leia is trying to find out when the Noghri world became polluted, originally thinking it had been a recent occurrence, with the book saying, "Leia put her hand against the smooth wood of the genealogy chart, her knee suddenly feeling weak with shock. 44 years. Not the 5 or 8 or even 10 that she'd assumed. 44. It didn't happen during the rebellion," she heard herself say. "It happened during the Clone Wars." So considering that Dark Force Rising takes place in 9 ABY, this specific date would put the Clone Wars in the Thrawn trilogy's depiction at least as having started in 35 BBY, as opposed to the real date of 22 BBY. This is 3 years before even the Phantom Menace takes place, and lines up with what Michael Stackpole's idea for the period seems to be. That number comes up once again in yet another one of Timothy Zahn's books, Vision of the Future, which takes place 10 years after the Thrawn trilogy. Talon Card says at one point in the book, the story of George Cardass goes back about 60 years, to the Clone Wars era and the chaos that it brought to the galaxy. Exactly 60 years ago would have been about 41 BBY, a whole 2 decades before the established Clone Wars, though he does say about 60 years, so that still lines up with the other 2 sources there, where they reference it as being about the mid-30s BBY. There's other references to similar timelines, like with the Dark Jedi on Dagobah fighting Yoda, but for now we'll move on to the more interesting part, depictions of who was fighting who during the Clone Wars. Well, we now know the Clone Wars were, aside from all the more local forces who were fighting, primarily between clones who were defending the Republic and the droid armies of the Confederacy attacking it. The early depictions of the Clone Wars tend to reference it as though the clones were a menace to the galaxy unleashed by their clone masters and used to assault the Republic. In the Thrawn trilogy, Thrawn is using old cloning technology to build an army, and a thought by Pelion supports that interpretation. Given the destruction they'd unleashed on the galaxy, Pelion had always assumed that the clone masters had eventually found at least a partial solution to the problem of clone madness. Whether they had recognized the underlying cause of the madness was another question entirely. In the same series, Mara Jade, a former Emperor's Hand, makes a similar reference when she's explaining why she's bothering to help Luke or the New Republic at all. The only reason I'm here is because I know a little about the Clone Wars era, and don't want to see a bunch of cold-faced duplicates trying to overrun the galaxy again. A decade later, during the Hand of Thrawn duology, Leia and Han come across several Soontir Fel clones who had been made by Thrawn, and who were concerned about their place in the galaxy if they were to reveal themselves because of the stigma surrounding clones. Kareb shook his head. "We have no friends," he said, "and if we're a long way past the Clone Wars, we're not nearly so far past Grand Admiral Thrawn's use of soldiers like us in his bid for power." When discussing the Clone Wars, and specifically the clone of Jedi Master Joruus C'baoth, Pelion, who had served in the Republic fleet during the Clone Wars, makes another reference that both throws off the timeline, although the fact that C'baoth died long before the Clone Wars wasn't actually established until later, and supports the idea of clones attacking the Republic. "Certainly," Thrawn said, "created from a tissue sample, probably sometime just before the real C'baoth's death." "Early in the war, in other words," Pelion said, swallowing hard. "The early clones, or at least those the fleet had faced, had been highly unstable, both mentally and emotionally, sometimes spectacularly so. And you deliberately bought this thing aboard my ship?" he demanded. So Pelion is making a reference to the Republic fleet fighting clones. Thrawn also makes a reference to the additional vowels being put in C'baoth's name, Joruus C'baoth rather than Joruus C'baoth, which somewhat implies that rather than being a clone army built off of one single main template, the original Clone Wars possibly involved some other mass cloning of many of the galaxy's inhabitants, who were then used to assault the original Republic, and possibly even in some sort of subterfuge where the way that they pronounced their name was the only way you could actually tell that they were not the original person. But that's also just my own reading of that. That is entirely my interpretation, so take that with every grain of salt in the galaxy. While that's just the approach taken by the books of the period, which tend to be what I'm more familiar with, I'd like to also specifically highlight how the Clone Wars are portrayed in the early Star Wars comics, particularly the early Marvel comics, which take yet another approach to the Clone Wars. The issue I'm referencing in particular, Marvel Star Wars 68, was actually released about half a year before even Return of the Jedi, so some details from the original trilogy weren't even established yet. In this issue, a Mandalorian named Fen Shisa references being sent into the Clone Wars by Mandalore on the side of the Emperor, who was setting up his empire concurrently with the Clone Wars, and that he first became familiar with Leia during briefings on the Empire's enemies, and after that references the war finally coming to an end. This seems to imply a Clone War that takes place much, much later than the ultimate dates we got, and later still than the directions the novels took. It also gives a very different interpretation of Mandalorian involvement with both the Clone Wars, the Confederacy, and the Empire that we later got. But a lot of that was handled through direct retcons later on, whereas a lot of the things related to dates in both the comics and novels tended to fall by the wayside. And just to be clear, none of this is intended to say that these sources are therefore bad because they took a different direction with the Clone Wars than what we ultimately got from George Lucas. None of them could know what the plans were at that point because a lot of the plans didn't exist. It's just interesting to look at how the details of these things changed between when they were introduced in the original trilogy to being discussed in the novels later on to their ultimate depiction in the prequel trilogy. In the older periods, especially with Marvel Star Wars, Bantam Books, and even the relationship between Bantam and Dark Horse, the creators of the Dark Empire, there was less of a concern with making one single consistent universe rather than just telling stories within that broader idea of there being a Star Wars universe. But that gets into a whole other discussion on what it means to be canon and what the different approaches to that within Star Wars have been. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Clone Wars depictions in the 80s and 90s. It took a lot of digging around to compile it, but it was also a lot of fun. If you liked the video, make sure to press the button to say so or leave a comment letting me know what you thought. All that user engagement stuff really does help with the channel and is greatly appreciated. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please leave those in the comments as well. Comments, not comics. Don't make any. If you want to make comics and leave those in the comments, do that too. But thanks again for watching, and hope to see you next time.